Business is a new clock in the back. Forget the lights, keep the clock.
Yeah, I don't know if did you guys notice that, the lights have been altered? To,
Oh, yeah.
now we have the ability to just turn off those lights at that, projector screen, so we can see that's a great shit. Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. We start the sooner we end. So first order of business is the review of the minutes from the February 22nd meeting. Everyone has those in the packet. Occasions, additions, deletions. I would note, it wouldn't affect the minutes, but a lot of the commentary and conversation related to the 355 Maple Avenue had to do with what level of investment and infrastructure we wanted them to put in until there was a tri-party agreement. And I believe about a week later, we've got a tri-party agreement. So Mike, you may have.
We do, apparently we do, and apparently both, cave builders and the township and Fox Lane all signed that agreement, but it was at the bank level in order to sign off on the financials regarding the agreement. So it was still being held up, and we still don't have confirmation that that was fine. So as of now, the cul-de-sac plan is still on the agenda for the Board of Supervisors meeting next week, 2 weeks.
When I spoke with Chris Canavan, he said he's pretty confident the Fox Lane wants to, they're getting that done. Now they've got the financing lined up. They want to go ahead and get that in, and that was obviously our bias as well, was to not have a temporary, but have something that's a more permanent solution, which sounds like they're getting closer. So any modification?
No.
Then a motion to approve is submitted.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second. Thank you, David. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Abstain. I wasn't there.
Thank you much. All right, parking ordinance.
Okay, so parking ordinance amendment, if you can remember, 285 Maple Avenue, what is now Clifton Berries, that site. They came in and the applicant actually wanted to, at the time, renovate for a restaurant, which is the Clifton Berries, and then renovate for the office, which is the title company in the front. But then they also had unused space in the back, and their concern is that they were not able to use that unused space because of the extraneous parking requirements regarding restaurants being 1 per 80, and their argument was that since they were still categorized as a restaurant because they're selling food for consumption, they are required 1 per 80 square feet, 1 space per 80 square feet. They did not need that much, and so they wanted to go down the path of requesting that the ordinance be revised or amended to allow some relief for the smaller types of restaurants or the different types of restaurants that do not necessarily need that much parking. So that being said, this is the iteration. It's still in draft form, so this is just for discussion this evening. And what you see in front of you is are the red lines that we have so far at staff level and the comments from the township solicitor regarding the proposed amendment. So under the current ordinance, we have certain regulations regarding specific calculations for a limited amount of uses. Okay, and then if you can't meet those particular, or if your use does not align with any of the uses that are listed, okay, then you can move on to option B, which is subsection B, regarding going to the ITE manual, finding your use in the ITE manual, and then doing calculations from there. This proposal also includes, that's actually an existing ordinance item. That would just be revised a little bit. This ordinance also includes an additional subsection C that says if your use is not in the ITE manual, then you can do another study on the side and submit it for a separate approval. Okay, so the wording of this subsection C is still needs to be revised and refined, because as indicated in the red line from Andy Freeman, he says that it's a slippery slope with this one because it seems like it gives a lot of leeway to an applicant to basically say that they cannot comply with the specific calculation in subsection A. They don't have a specific use in the ITE, so they only have one option, which is to do their own calculation and justify it in their own way, and potentially get away with much less parking than what would be actually appropriate for the use. So it's in front of you tonight, just so you know we can incorporate any of your comments regarding this as we move forward.
Yeah, so I was hoping you would touch on the Andy comment there in the dialogue box. So he's saying, you know, if it's gonna stay, then what kind of objective criteria? And I think he's right, like them just saying, well, I can't meet that standard, so here's what I'm telling you, I think is a reasonable standard and how much of the building I think I'm gonna use now. And, you know, so then we find ourselves basically, you know, self-diagnosed cures of parking requirements, which I don't think we want to do. So how do we respond to Andy's comment? You're gonna go think up something brilliant?
Yeah, always. Absolutely, and absolutely, any ideas from the planning commission, I think would be greatly appreciated. But one thing that I have seen through the years is some townships have a more extensive list of parking requirements for each specific use. Our township's ordinance is abbreviated in that, first of all, we don't have what's called like a use regulation section where it actually lists all the uses in the township, you know, 1 to 100 or however many, every use that's permitted in the township. And then it also even gets into detail as to specific requirements for each one of those uses. It makes it easy when you get to the section like this, like the parking requirement section, where it takes those uses and it assigns a required parking calculation. And since our ordinance doesn't necessarily, you know, have those specific lists, it makes the parking requirement section more ambiguous. Okay, so even if your particular use isn't, it may be aligned with something that is listed in a parking section, the applicant can claim it's not specifically exactly the way it's noted.
But that's where I was wondering if they come back and say it's not in the, you know, ITE manual, my use isn't in there, which I would find surprising, but possible. Can we have the ordinance say, then the township will assign what is the most appropriate analogous use?
Based on the list in the ordinance?
On the ordinance or in the manual?
Oh, right. Yeah.
I mean, a real common way is that they'll just throw out a phrase in there, you know, proposed use doesn't match, then you use X number of spaces. Right, that's pretty standard. But I think if we're gonna, you know, go along with the ITE manual, which I do think is a good idea, because they're up to the addition now, and every addition, they keep adding more and more uses. Keep making it more accurate.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
And then the only other thing that I'm more curious about is the last sentence brings up the point, which is we go through all this, then somebody sells the property, the new moves in, it's not the exact same use. How do we help? I mean, somebody could buy a property and then find out they don't have enough parking. How do we?
That, let's see, the township zoning officer shall be notified and required off parking space shall be reallocated for some section. Is that the sentence you're?
Yeah,
So. Generally speaking, in any case, that actually happens where a property switches ownership. And then unbeknownst to the new owner, since they are proposing a different use or parking is required. That actually happens at 285A. They thought that they could just move in and use the building with the existing park. They did not know that they would need more parking. So
I think you need to have.
we
Just
check,
because it gives you something to point to.
we check that every time a change in use, parking is checked for every change in use in the township. Because they are required to obtain a use and occupancy permit. So it has to cross my desk.
yeah, I was just more curious about the crossover. Anybody else have any other comments?
No, I think just that one concept of another, source has a exact.
So in that case, then the township reserves the right to identify the ITE use. Right, rather than
Yeah.
give the applicant the ability to make up their own use.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So what about then subsection C? Will subsection C just go away? Or delete them?
I think it could, you could just add to the piece if it's not clearly identifiable, and the township would identify the most closely related use in the manual.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, at a certain point, if we all agree that's the most appropriate analogous use that's in the manual, and that's what the manual says is the parking requirement, and you can't satisfy it, then as a township, we've got a concern. I think that just gets us to the answer.
Makes sense.
And I mean, they should have a concern as well. I mean,
Right.
Oh, yeah.
for any business, you want to have parking for your staff and your company.
I think where we need to. Developer,
Yeah,
that's where.
yeah.
End user, I agree with you. They're gonna know they need. They're not as things like they can't. Them apart.
All right, so we'll see the next turn of the document.
I'm sorry.
We'll see the next turn.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
That's, I think some of this was kind of spurred because the Sips and Berries. They felt that they were required to have too much parking. Do you think that this could result in the same issue for other properties? Or was it a to be determined thing? By, because you haven't really changed the requirement for restaurants. Right. And that's how this began, if I remember correctly. The issue was some areas having too much required parking, and they had to expand their parking lot, which was a little bit more of a burden for them.
No, that's a very good point, Claire, because this was also supposed to go hand in hand with definitions. The addition of
Right.
definitions for restaurants, so not just restaurant, but fast food, sit down. If David Goodwin was here, he'd be able to identify.
Bakery.
Sorry,
Bakery.
yeah, bakery, things like that, where if we had different categories and different parking allocations for each of those categories. So that's a good point. So Sips and Berries would not necessarily be considered to be a restaurant.
Okay.
Okay, so it's very good.
It's someplace like a to-go place, because a lot of people drop in, order something online, we can get it, get out.
Right.
Or DoorDash does it for them, so.
County plan reviews?
Yes, okay, so I sent along a memo last week that very briefly summarized the edits that I made since the last meeting that I think we spoke mostly about the walls and window ratio. So I will address that, but then also Mike and I were discussing or going through the district edits. So line by line, we stumbled upon the conditional uses and the requirements that would have to be met by conditional uses. And a few questions arose from that, from reading over that a little bit more closely. So right now there are 20 uses that are listed as conditional uses in the village district. And there are general conditions for those uses that they would have to meet in order to be approved. And then there are specific conditions. And there are different specific conditions depending on if there is a property, an existing principal building that existed at the time of the passing of this article. So the question that arises from that is this a good measurement for properties to have a building that existed at the time of the passing of the article that they, let me take that back. So the specific conditions would require that that principal building that existed or that exists would have to be preserved. And the question is should that be required for conditional uses if there's an existing building? And if the intent of the district is to preserve architecturally significant or historically significant buildings, then is that the best way to go about it?
So, yeah, so Claire and I had a lengthy discussion regarding this. And what we were talking about is because we're potentially going to be expanding the VC district down Main Street. It's going to incorporate different buildings that were not in the vision of the VC district way back when it was first established. And some of these are ranch style, residential, single family residential homes that are set back from the road. And so these would be essentially buildings that meet this criteria built before the passage of this article. And so do those standards, and I would argue that they don't, but do these standards, should they apply to these new buildings that will be potentially brought into the VC district? So essentially, it just seems from my perspective that a large portion of this district requirements is something that is not necessary. Okay, I think it's not necessary because it repeats itself in many cases, and it's not applicable in some cases as well.
So one other thing is that in other sections of this district, there are references to buildings that are built before 1940, that standard cutoff line. And so if this is still a goal of the village district to preserve these buildings, that could be something that could be considered. Having, if there's a principal building that existed prior to 1940 or was constructed before 1940, then it would have to meet these preservation requirements.
So you're going on historical.
So that's the question. If that is the intent, which it sounds like it by reading it. So I wanted to get a better sense of if that's the intent of these conditions. And if that would be an alternative way that wouldn't then include some of these older buildings that don't really fit that character, that village character that we might be after.
But how do you legislate that? What does and doesn't feel like? I mean, you're talking about section 2 here, right?
Yes,
Looking at
so-
your memo, right? The existing principal buildings may be raised as part of the conditional use application when they meet the following criteria are met.
yes,
And first, they have to demonstrate that the building is structurally unsound or otherwise unsuitable for rehabilitation. The replacement building will meet the architectural standards. And the proposed development utilizes a neighborhood development option under this chapter.
The question is it the intent to save and preserve ugly buildings?
Really?
I mean, otherwise, you are right,
Yeah.
because otherwise in the section that we're looking at, you end up with North Broad Street and Hatfield Township. That's what you get. You know, you got all these old houses, large houses that live in a house. And,
Or it's not doing the.
now, you know, like just above Lansing, you got that whole section. You go all the way out to 309. That's one of those classic old neighborhoods. It's like that whole thing from the community mall. Yeah, I mean, I would hope that this would be an encouragement for people to put. And improve them, give them the ability to. I guess get more on it, is why I'm encouraged. Them more hours, do something.
so many uses that fall under that conditional use
Yeah.
process.
So one of the thoughts that we had regarding that is for the VC district, I like to keep it as simple as possible in the zoning ordinance. For the VC district, there's a vision that the planning commission has to look village-like, potentially historical if possible, right? To bake that into the zoning ordinance direct and under general regulations. In the existing ordinance, what we're discussing is specifically under conditional use. So from my perspective, it appears as if these requirements or regulations should be for everyone in the VC district, if applicable, right? Okay, so
Right, I see.
I'm asking the planning commission, if you don't mind, take a look at this subsection B, which is specific conditions for properties which contain principal buildings that existed at the time of the passing of this article. And it's
on
under,
page 5, sorry, it's on page 5 of the draft that you have also in front of you. You want to hard copy.
actually, I'm sorry, look at this entire section, which is subsection 70.3, which pertains to standards and criteria for conditional uses. A lot of these, again, are superfluous because they pertain to general standards that all conditional uses would have to comply with anyway. That's in a different section of the zone. It's
Right.
about like the neighborhood and traffic, that sort of thing. So I don't think there's a real need to repeat it in the VC district. And then you get to subsection B, which specifically calls out existing buildings at the passing of this article, which is somewhat vague because you're trying to figure out when the article was passed and it's difficult to follow sometimes. But then it talks about preserving basically the quality, the look of the district. So again, why is that just in the conditional use section? Why isn't that just taken out and simply put in a general conditions section? And then essentially all of this, which is 2-3 pages worth of specific conditional use requirements, it all just goes away and saving some of very little of this and put it in a general conditions section.
Two comments very quickly. One is that there's a bonus structure that's currently in the code and would continue to be in this version of the draft for preserving a building built before 1940. That's one of the ways you can get a density bonus or commercial square footage bonus. So that probably would end up being removed if this becomes a requirement across the board. And then also sometimes places don't like to require the preservation of buildings, which is why it might be a condition. Rather than requiring an older building outright to be preserved, then you start getting into the territory of historic preservation ordinances and become a little bit more complicated. Not to say that I don't support that, but that's just one consideration. I think that may have been why it was placed as a criteria for the conditional use rather than just put in the ordinance overall.
Streamlining the ordinance and not being redundant, I'm all in favor of that, because try to clean that up wherever, but I guess, John, I'm just worried about what is the intent of village commercial. I think village commercial is for village characteristic. I don't know that it's supposed to be a robust commercial strip of larger buildings. Like, I think we do want people to redevelop the building stock that's there.
Right, but we just had an experience where an existing building was driving the bus, right? If you think about all these buildings, across from the bank. What I'm concerned about is now they're gonna say, oh, well, the building exists and it's set back, so I have to. And the whole point is, it's like a 50s rancher, it's not even, or a 60s rancher. Not that they're necessarily ugly looking, I'm just saying they can be if they get run down.
Right.
And you get somebody that doesn't take care of their property. But that aside, the experience out in Burnfield, that completely kind of turned upside down the whole notion of what we thought the village should be, because it was a pre-existing building and you can't move it, you got to deal with setbacks, all that kind of stuff. In fact, these may actually be worse or more difficult to deal with in the sense that they're just regular lots and they tended to put one big footprint right in the middle of the lot, so we could get some strange configuration. And the flip side of it would be if you look at this isn't village, but I think the effect is or if you look at the Dennis, that's a little closer to the road, there's no parking in the front. Parking's at the side and near the building. And I'd rather have somebody knock down one or two of those ranchers and put that kind of because it looks better, it has more.
You're talking about the one on somebody town just
Yeah, maybe rather, yeah. I mean, I think they did a great job with that, the actual siting. So, yeah, and maybe, I think it might not be a bad idea to relook at this. Streamline learning. And decide what would be the best way to handle all the building.
Yeah, 'cause I like that financial planning building right there. That's a good example.
Yeah.
Parking behind there, that's a nice, that's full front of the parking. That's right before all those ranchers still.
Yeah, because the areas that we're talking about adding and the area that was just added, they actually do have.
Ones you're all saying though are in the RO.
Yeah,
Yeah, so they got developed under a different standard.
right.
The original.
So do you think that for older buildings, should there be criteria for the ones that are preserved? Should this be a requirement? Should it be incentivized? There are two different things to consider when. And what makes a building worth preserving?
Well, it has to be sound. Preserving, it has to be livable.
But are there like visual characteristics that would be, or does it not matter as long as it, it looks nice generally, or is there a specific style that would be in the goal for the village?
I mean, I think generally we've tried to get away from doing historical designations, and I think we've generally tried to stay away from design criteria. I mean, we have the design criteria for the village commercial, but it's about scale
Yeah.
and features, but not style.
So that's the one, not concern, but just, hesitation about having anything about preserving buildings because you can start really easily veering into that water of requiring certain characteristics of older buildings.
Yeah, but I guess, so help me out on this, because I guess on the flip side, while I don't support the township dictating and controlling everything, I sure would hate to see somebody come in and say, hey, I can, like the Five Brothers building or the Harleysville Hotel, somebody comes in and says, well, I think I can put something bigger there, so I'm knocking it down, and there it goes, and we're like, hold on a second, like, that's part of the whole fabric and characteristic of the thing, so how do you force a conversation around that says you can't knock it down unless?
There are demolition delays, that's something that some places do, but that's again with historic districts, so that's the first thing that comes to my mind, rather than demolishing a building that's on the table, you would be able to, discuss with the applicant alternatives demolition. But you probably want to get a step ahead of that, right?
Correct me, but that usually just drags it out, I don't know that it changes the outcome.
I mean, Mike needs to think 5 times longer.
Right.
Processing the demolition.
Yeah, so even buildings that are designated as historic under the National Register aren't forbidden from being demolished. There's obvious consequences. You lose out on any tax exemption for residential structures and lose out on whatever incentive for non-residential. But aside from paying the consequences, you can still demolish. It's still a choice.
Just out of curiosity, what did we pick 1930 or 1940? 1940. Do we know why we picked 1930? Because I don't know, like that might be part of the issue, is like, yeah, that might be, it might be, yeah, you're right.
There tends to be a difference in architecture.
Yeah,
Well, after
the world,
like after more like 1945.
yeah, sure, yeah.
1940. Well, even then, you're still gonna run into the one problem with hard date. Not all buildings are worth saving.
Right.
You get people who have not maintained their property. You just say it's an eyesore. There's like 1 or 2 next to the bike shop here. They're old, it's looking at them, but I would hate to have fire to preserve them.
But the ones across the street are in actually pretty good shape.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly,
Yeah.
But
That one you mentioned also has a substantial barn, which would be a shame.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of the properties that have those rear alleys have some really nice carriage barn type.
Be a principal building, that would just be an
Yeah,
accessory building. Well, I guess one option could be to require the preservation of buildings that were built before 1940. That's something that I would want to actually check with the solicitor about.
Yeah, I don't know if we can actually require the
Yeah.
preservation of anything. It would be if and where possible. When appropriate. That's why it's difficult in providing incentive, right, which is the bonus that reinforces it. So you have the intent of the district to preserve such building. Which is an intent, not a requirement, and you have the incentive for bonus if you preserve a building of that character, that age. That reinforces it. And I don't know, maybe put it in a general regulation section that buildings of that importance shall be shall be preserved where possible, or some wording like that. So require it, but then with the caveat where possible, or where appropriate, or whatever the wording might be.
So I'm good with that. I think that's fair. So incentives plus, preserve where possible. So to John's point, if it's just not worth saving and, we all agree, then let's just move on. Claire, remind us what the incentives are?
The incentives are the preservation of a building constructed before 1940, shared parking and driveway of abutting lots, and the inclusion of a certain amount of public space.
Right, but I'm saying, what do you?
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, sorry, I meant the list of, so in order to, so if you preserve a building that's constructed before 1940, you would be able to increase the dwelling units by 0.5 dwelling units per acre, for no more than 7.5 dwelling units per acre across the board. Right now, the density, maximum density would be 6 units, so you could increase it by an additional 1.5 dwelling units per acre. And then for non-residential, you can increase non-residential development may be increased by an additional 5% of the net lot area for each of the bonus options listed below. And in no case shall the non-residential development with the bonus be more than 25% of the net lot area.
Be honest, I don't know if we're gonna stop a lot of development. I don't know if we're gonna stimulate a lot of development.
No, I think that will encourage some people to do. We've already had pretty good luck with some of the preservation here and also the shared driveway. That one, I think really.
Well, and I think actually the building preservation might be more enticing to some developers because either a shared driveway easement or interconnected driveway tends to scare them off, or one of the parties isn't willing to do it. This is at least something they can control on their part.
That's true.
So just to summarize, so I am clear on this, so we'll have in the general regulations, there will be provision to preserve buildings when feasible, possible. And then there would also just be that bonus option and then get rid of this criteria in the condition. Okay.
Everybody good with that?
Yes.
Okay.
And then, have you, has Andy looked at the full ordinance so far or not yet?
He has.
Okay.
He didn't have a lot of comments about that. I think he had a lot of little comments here and there about other things. But nothing, I would like to send him the newer version again and speak. with him.
Yeah, I think. That's good.
Mhm.
We don't have to take that.
Yeah, when our next meeting.
Did we talk about the microbrewery at our
Oh,
last PC meeting?
We
We were talking at staff level about the amendments that the plan and talked about that the ordinance was amended for the AO district regarding the microbrewery. To add special conditions to add a microbrewery use to the AO district with certain parameters. So we were discussing at staff level regarding adding that to the VC district also and to the commercial district.
For the VC, the commercial district, I don't know, for the VC district. I think we should get the VC district done. And then we should think about the large track overlay. And then we could think about whether or not the microbrewery goes in the entire district or is just in the large track
Oh, okay.
overlay. My thought being there. I've seen the parking at microbrewery things get
That was my,
nuts.
yeah.
Yeah,
So putting it in the total district could be problematic, but I could see where having it in the large tract overlay could be appropriate and enticing.
yeah, I think it's appropriate. there.
Yeah.
And absolutely. I guess the only thing that may not work with that is when they choose to come in. Because I guess now they've closed on the back building, is that what I understand? Well,
Oh, it's all one.
I was just talking to Chris Gannon this morning.
They call it Acorn School,
Oh, is that
but
what
it's
they're
still
called?
the same parcel, but
The back.
somebody gave it the address.
But they made the sale and they're currently demolishing the back building. For a future use and office.
I'm
Right.
sorry, but demolishing the old Heavner building?
Not the whole building, just the inside.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's what I
They're
thought.
renovating.
Yeah, okay, yeah, demolish.
It was still the reason why I said they didn't. They pulled a permit to demolish the inside. In an appropriate level before they,
Oh, I got you.
and normally we don't issue the demolition permit. As part of a renovation, it's part of a fit out. But they asked to do that because they were ready to demolish, but they didn't have the plans ready.
Oh.
Fit out.
So,
Yeah,
so anyway, what my point is though, that they've been decoupled. The other guys, Velocity Ventures, they're the ones that. Yeah. And be in a big hurry in the back on the front piece, so.
But I thought, I guess I misunderstood. I thought Velocity was selling the entire thing to those guys and they're just moving forward. Phase one is to get his IP.
That's what I thought too, but that's different.
So it's all one parcel, so the whole parcel is now owned. For a.
Yeah, Velocity's out completely. My understanding.
I thought they originally brought,
I think some of their partners are forming in. I believe.
but Velocity also is the insurance, the old insurance. company.
Yeah.
I thought that's when we originally talked about the microbreweries, was the
Right.
insurance.
Yeah, that's pretty. Yeah, that's what Microsoft on the AO did. But it's not a bad idea to. Just finish the ordinance and then take a look at. That parcel and see what you could put in there, right, we could maybe run a few tests or so. Cause you do have a point that in some locations, I could see in some locations, but in other locations, it could be a rule.
A lot of towns, they put them in the industrial parks. They could drive around the bow, because the hours overlap enough from a parking
Right.
perspective. That you can leverage the parking, in those large complexes. There's some of them you're hunting, like the one downtown mentioned, which I think is closing now, but you're hunting for the entrance for it, the one over.
But the old bank building in the
Yeah.
center of town,
Yeah.
I think you're upwards of 200 parking
Yeah.
spaces. And the IT business that'll be in the back building is primarily a daytime use, so by the time you get to nighttime, I think.
Parking.
Huh.
It's
You
surprising.
don't realize.
Yeah.
Start to walk it. So yeah, that would be my recommendation is. Let's get this ordinance done. Without any microbrewery added in now, then come back and figure out the large track overlay and figure out the microbrewery into that.
Yeah.
That good, Mike?
Yes, thank you.
All right. There being no other items on the agenda, a motion to adjourn. Make the motion. Thank you, Dave. Thank you. All in favor?
Sir, did you just have nothing better to do on a Wednesday night, or is there anything we can do for you?
No, I'm just taking notes.
Oh, welcome.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.